Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining today. Today it's going to be the third webinar of the ECMAScript features in Lightning Web Components series. And we are going to take a look at the features from ECMAScript 11 and 12, which is the one from last year and the one that is being released or published this year in June. And if you don't know me, my name is Alba Rivas. I am a developer advocate at Salesforce. And here you have my contact details in case that you want to ask me anything later. But also you can write questions on the chat window. And at the end of the presentation, I will be responding questions. So this is our favorite slide, the forward-looking statement slide, which just means that Salesforce is a publicly traded company and that you should make purchases based on the functionality that is generally available. But everything that we are going to see today is standard JavaScript, so we are not doing any forward-looking statements, really. So as I said, this is the third webinar of a series. If you haven't watched the first two webinars, I recommend you to take a look at them because in the first webinar, I explained everything in regards to what is ECMAScript, what is JavaScript, how Lightning Web Components compilation works, and what implications that does it have on which features you can use safely in your Lightning Web Components applications, right? And in the second webinar, I went through the most interesting features for me from ECMAScript 9 and ECMAScript 10. So if you are interested, take a look at these two webinars. And today we are going to finish this series talking about features from ECMAScript 11 and 12. This is a summary table in which I took note of all the different features that I'm showcasing in the webinar series. Today we are going to focus in these two columns here. We are going to see ECMAScript 12, which is the one from 2021, which is closing this year in June, and the ones from ECMAScript 2020, the ones that were released last year. Here in the table you can see some features in light blue. They are in light blue because they are only available or they only work when using Lightning Web Components outside of the platform. And this is normally due to local service. Okay, so let me go to a sample app I created. I will share with you the links to this sample app and another sample app I have created using Lightning Web Components open source. The idea of the sample app is to have kind of recipes that show you how to use the different JavaScript features, right? With so that I demonstrate to you that in fact you can use them inside of the platform and also with Lightning Web Components outside of the platform. If something is not working for you, make sure that for instance in Lightning Web Components open source, make sure that you have the same package.json configuration than I, because some people has reached out to me with that problem, and it happened that it was a problem with it was the LWC services version that they were using. And also make sure that all your VS Code extensions are up to date, because if VS Code extensions are not up to date, they may be highlighting problems that are not really a problem. For instance, that happened to me with the newly coalescing operator, that my VS Code extension was saying this is something that you cannot use in Lightning Web Component, but that was not true. It was, the problem is I was using an old version of VS Code extensions and I didn't realize. Okay, so with that, let's start talking about these amazing features. So each recipe, it's a card in which I'm explaining what's the feature about. You have links to the documentation in MDN if you want to know more. And normally there is a function with an example implementation that you can execute. The way to see the result of this function is to open the console in Developer Tools, because basically I'm using console.log to log the expected results and to demonstrate how to use the feature. So the first feature that I want to talk about today is promise all settled. With promise all settled, what we do is that we wait for an array of promises or an iterable of promises to be settled. When we say that a promise is settled, it means that the promise is either fulfilled or rejected. That means that what is going to happen when we use all settled is that we are going to wait for all the promises to be fulfilled or reject, and then we are going to be able to execute a function asynchronously, and this function is going to receive as a parameter an array with the different results of the different promises that have executed. So in this example, for instance, we have a promise which is resolving, that one is going to fulfill. We have a second promise which is rejecting, that one is going to reject. We are creating an array of promises, and we are using promise all settled over this array of promises. When these promises, the first one resolves and the second one rejects, then this function here is going to execute asynchronously. And in the function, we are receiving the results of the promises execution as a parameter. So what I do here is that I iterate over the results array, and I log the result status, the status of each promise. So what I expect to see here is that the first promise status was fulfilled and the second promise status was rejected. If I execute the sample function, we see here that this is exactly what we were expecting. This can be very convenient to you when you are doing, parallel API callouts for which you don't mind if one succeeds of one or another one fails, and you want to get the results for all of them, for instance. In that use case, it can be helpful for you. Then we have string.prototype.matchAll. This one is also interesting when you are working with strings and you want to find a specific pattern that may appear multiple times in the string. So for instance, here we are creating a regular expression which is saying I want to find the pattern Astro or Cody. Either of two options is what I want to find in my string. And the string is this one here. We have Astro and Cody went dancing. Astro really enjoyed it, while Cody didn't like it at all. So there are 4 occurrences of my regular expression, right? 4 matches. So this string match all function is going to return an iterable. Here, for convenience, I'm using the spread operator that we saw in the previous webinar, because I want to spread the different values that are returned in my match all function execution, but you could iterate over the returned values. The individual returned values are objects, right? It's an object that I think is called regular expression result, something like that. I don't remember exactly. And this object is going to contain, is an array that is going to contain the pattern that has been found, the index at which it has been found, the input that we used, and also if it was found in a group, right? So this is what we expect to receive, or to our example to log in the console when we execute match all. If I execute the sample function, effectively we see that these are the returned match results. So that can be very useful as well in some cases. Then we have module namespace exports. But for explaining these features, I'm going to better show you the source code because I think it's going to be easier. So in this example, what I did was to create a module. This is a module called utils.js, right? And in this module, I'm doing two exports. I'm doing a named export, which is dance, is a function that is going to print something to the console, right? And I'm doing a default export. I'm doing both kind of exports because I want to demonstrate that with the export wildcard syntax, you are able to import both of them, right? So then we have a second module, which I have called module exports out for auxiliary module, right? And here is where we are going to use our new feature, which is the ability to write export everything as whatever from whatever module. So behind the scenes, this export syntax works as if you were using an import everything and then export it, right? Before this syntax was available, this was the way in which you could import everything from a module and export it so that it can be used from another module that is using the import from here, right? And then we have a third Lightning Web component, which is the one of the example, right? In which we are importing utils. But look, we are importing utils from our auxiliary module, right? And here we are demonstrating how you can use this syntax here. Then in our module exports, we have we are able to use our utils.dance function, which is the one that was a named export, and we are able to use our utils.default, right? Function, because default is like the name that the default export has. And that way we are able to use both functions, the one that prints this to the console and the one that prints this to the console. So if I execute this sample function here, let me first clear the console, we are going to see that effectively we see Astro Dance Rock, which is what our dance method was printing to the console, and Cody played electronic music, which is what our default export was doing. So great, this is a way in which you can export everything from one module to another, but be careful because sometimes that can be in my case, I prefer to have the control of what I'm exporting and what I'm importing so that that doesn't become unmanageable. Great. And next, in ECMAScript 2020, we have two features that you are going to love, I'm sure, because these two features help you to write a much cleaner code. And I think they are going to make you more productive as a developer, and you are going to enjoy using these features because I am. Okay, so the first one is the newest coalescing operator. For this one, I'm going to show you an example first of how you implement the same behavior without using the operator. I have the example here, so let me copy it and paste it into the console. Let's take a look first at the example that doesn't use the operator, which is this one, right? So in this example, what we do is we have an object called Astro, and Astro has a property which is dancing. Then we declare a variable dancing abilities, and what we want to do is to always assign a value to that variable, right? If my astro dancing property is not nullish, this means it's not null and it is not undefined, we are going to use that value for our dancing abilities variable. But if this parameter here is null or undefined, then we are going to use a default value. The usage of this operator is to assign a default value when something is null or undefined. So if we log here dancing abilities, we see that as in this case astro dancing existed, right? Then we are dancing ability gets the value of astro dances salsa. That is the way to implement this behavior without using the newest coalescing operator. But with the newest coalescing operator, the code becomes much simpler because you can do exactly the same in just one line. So here we are checking if astro dancing is nullish. If it is nullish, we are going to return this default value. And if it is not nullish, we are going to return the astro dancing value. So here in this case, we expect the astro dances salsa to be picked from here. But if we try to access to a property which is astro singing, which doesn't exist, then the default value is going to be returned. So super useful. Let's execute the sample function and see how it looks like. And here we have that indeed in the first case the astro dancing is taken from here, and in the second case we take the default value, which is the one on the right hand side of the operator. Very useful. And then the other operator that I'm sure that you are going to love is optional chaining. Optional chaining is equivalent to the Apex safe navigation operator, and optional chaining is going to allow you to execute a function or access a property of an object only if that function or property exists. That way we are going to avoid null pointer exceptions. That's the common use case. And we are going to do the same. I'm going to show you the implementation without using the operator. And that way you are going to understand very well what the operator does. So here I'm on the console again, and I'm going to copy this code. Okay, sorry, let me refresh the page because I have copied several examples and one of the identifiers was already declared, but now it's okay. Okay, so for this example, what do we have? We have an object. This object has a property dancing, and this property is another object which has a property favorite song. So what we are going to do is that we want to access this property favorite song only if dancing exists. Why? Because if it doesn't, and if I try to access that property, then I may hit a null pointer exception, right? So the way to implement that without the optional chaining operator is doing if astro dancing is not null and is not undefined, is not nullish, then we are going to try to get favorite song. But if not, we are going to just return undefined to avoid that error. And here we can see that in this case, as favorite song exists, we are returning Bohemian Rhapsody. So now we are going to take a look at how this is implemented with the optional chaining operator, and it's as simple as you see here. Just a single line. With a single line, you are going to be able to return or execute the favorite song retrieval only if astro dancing is not nullish. Super cool. So in this case that we are trying to access astro dancing favorite song, this exist, so we are going to be able to get the Bohemian Rhapsody value. But in the second case, in which we are trying to retrieve like astro.singing.favorite song, astro.singing is does not exist, right? Is undefined, and in that case, the favorite song is something that we are not going to try to get from astro singing, and instead we are going to return undefined. If we execute the function, we are going to see that effectively in the first case, Bohemian Rhapsody is returned, and in the second case, undefined is returned. Great, so we are done with ECMAScript 2020 features. Let's go now to ECMAScript 2021 features. Here I have just 2 features because remember, ECMAScript 2021 is being released, and when I say released, I mean that the standard is closed. We take a picture of the standard as it is at that date, and that is going to happen in June, and that is going to shape the ECMAScript 2021 specification. So it's like very early to get these functions working, but it's also true that most of the browser vendors are already implementing those features, and you can already use them. For instance, you can use these 2 features, and we're going to see that in Lightning Web Components open source, you can use a couple more. So the first feature that I want to mention from ECMAScript 21 is a string prototype.replaceAll. With this replace all function, what we are going to do is to, well, first we specify a parameter, which is going to be the string or regular expression that we want to replace in our string. Okay, this is the string I'm going to operate in. And second, we specify a string, which is going to be the replacement, or here I can also specify a function that executes over all the occurrences that we find of our matched regular expression. Okay, so here very easy. We had Astro and Cody went to the cinema, and Astro loved the movie. So if we execute replace all, and I want to replace Astro by Cloudy, this function is going to find all the occurrences of Astro, which is this one and this one, and it's going to replace it by Cloudy and Cloudy. If I execute the function, that is what is going to happen. I don't know what you think, but I thought this function was already there because it's like a pretty common function that it's available in other languages, right? But it wasn't, so it's good that we have it now. And finally, we have here another promise function, which is promise.any. Promise.any is going to, well, it's something that you use to over an array of promises or an iterable of promises, right? And what it's going to do is to return the first promise that resolves, the first promise that is fulfilled and successfully executed, right? In the case that none of the promises fulfill, then it is going to return an aggregate error object that is going to contain all the errors for the individual rejected promises. So here, for instance, in our example, we have the first promise is resolving, the second promise is resolving. So if I execute promise.any, we are going to see that the first promise is the one that is returned by the method. Okay, here we are doing a console.log, and we're going to see that the first promise, as it resolves, it is the one that it is returned. If this promise is rejected, then the second promise would be returned. And in the case of having all the promises rejecting, we have two promises here and they are both rejecting, then what is going to happen is that the promise dot any promise is going to fail, right? We are going to execute, or it's going to be executed asynchronously, the callback that we pass in the coach block. And in our case, we are going to receive an aggregate error, which contains the individual errors for the different promises. And this means that all of them were rejected. Here, if I execute the promise, the sample function, well, let me clean this. We are going to see that indeed in the first example, this is what we expected to happen, that the first promise is the one that was returned. And in the second case, we receive an aggregate error because none of the promises fulfilled. Great. So now let me show you some of the features, because remember I told you there are some features that are available only in Lightning Web Components open source. So for that, what I did was I created another app, which is I'm running it in localhost. It's an application built with create a LWC app and Lightning Web Components open source. And here in ECMAScript 2020 and ECMAScript 2021, you are going to find a couple more features than the ones that we have showcased in the LWC application on the platform. So for instance, in ECMAScript 2020, you are going to have additionally the global list features. I'm not going to explain all the features in depth because I have only 3 minutes left, but I'm going to quickly go through them. Well, this one, it gives you an object called global list, which contains the global list value, and that is something that you can use in your code to use anything that it is scoped to the global list. This one is super interesting, but it cannot be used in Lightning Web Components because we don't allow for dynamic component instantiation. But it's interesting to use it outside of the platform because it allows you to import modules dynamically. Instead of importing them at the top of the file, you can import the modules at any point later. And this one is just a new property on the import object that gives you some description of the module that you are using or importing in your component, right? And this doesn't make sense on the platform because our modules don't have really an URL, but outside of the platform, it makes sense to use it. And finally, in ECMAScript 2021, there are also a couple of interesting features. There is one called logical assignment operators that are going to simplify the way in which you do assignment. Again, this is going to be as interesting as the new list coalescing operator and optional chaining because they are going to allow you to have a cleaner code. There is something called numeric separators that allow you to write numbers in a way in which they are easier to read, right? 1 million is much easier to read if you have the separators here. And then we have the finalizers and weak reference feature. This is a more complex feature to understand, but it has to do with the garbage collector, right? So in JavaScript, when an object is not used anymore, the garbage collector is going to collect it and remove it from memory. And a finalizer is something, a callback that you can specify to be executed when that happens. And for weak reference is a way to create an object, right, in memory, for which you which is weak, which is not going to, I mean, when you create a regular object, the garbage collector is not going to collect it until you stop using it and you remove all the references for it. This is typical, happens with event handlers. You have to remove event handlers specifically. But with weak references, you will allow for the garbage collector to collect your object before it gets dereferenced by any other reference in the application. So this can be useful as well, and it belongs to the same specification that the final RCS one, because they have much to do. Great. So with that, I want to finish the presentation. These are the repos for the two applications that I have been using along the series. The first one is ESXX features, and the second one ESXX features OSS. If you don't know earlier JavaScript features as those that came in ECMAScript 6, very important release, take a look at this trailhead module in which we explain to you all those features and how to work with modern JavaScript. I want to remind you the different ways to connect with us: Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and also YouTube, as where you are watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Click on the bell to receive notifications because we publish content very often. And thank you so much. So now I'm going to see if we have some remaining time for questions, and if not, you can also reach me on my social networks. Thank you.